forever and a day. Thomas never knew his father very well. The man was sad, and often seemed hesitant to even look at Thomas. He was a quiet man who seemed too nervous to speak even to his own wife. One night, when Thomas was very young, he was roaming the fields with his brother, and the two boys came across the old barn in which his father created his furniture. His brother urged Thomas to leave the barn alone. He had no desire to poke around his father's work and would rather spend what little free time they had running and playing. But Thomas was curious. He wanted to see where their father went every day and what he did with his time. After finding his way into the old barn, Thomas marveled at the tools and the furniture that was made from them. He wondered how a man so small and weak could create things of such beauty. His brother did not seem nearly as impressed. He followed Thomas through the old barn, telling him that beauty often hides great evil. But Thomas chose not to listen. Eventually, Thomas found his way to an old, dusty case which sat in the corner of the workshop. It looked as though it hadn't been opened for years, but Thomas wanted to know what was inside. His brother grabbed Thomas's arm and warned him that if he touched the box he would leave marks in the dust, and their father would know that they had been in his workshop. He would be furious, and they would get into trouble. Thomas knew the risk, but the mystery of what was inside that case would not let go of him. So he opened it. The boys stood, staring at the violin. At first, Thomas didn't know what it was or what it was meant for, but his brother explained. Afterward, Thomas touched one of the violin's strings and listened to the sound it made. He stood in awe of the object. It was such an interesting piece, so delicately crafted and with such weak components, and yet its sound was strong and crisp. He could break the violin in half, and yet it radiated power. Thomas wanted to hear the violin's music. He wanted to see what could be done with such an object, but his brother did not play, and Thomas would not know where to begin. So the boys left the violin and the old barn behind. But the violin stayed in Thomas's thoughts for years afterward. One Christmas, after his brother and older sister had left home, the man's wife decided to take her youngest child and spend Christmas with her family in another village. Thomas was left at home with his father, who had never been alone with Thomas before. The man seemed nervous. It was as though he did not know what to do or say to Thomas, and so he stood in the doorway of Thomas's room, staring at Thomas in silence until Thomas spoke to him. "Why do you keep me locked away?" Thomas asked his father. The man hesitated to answer, but eventually told him, "Because it's what I must do in order to save my family." "Two of your children are gone. Hasn't your family been lost already?" The man looked down at the floor and said, "I have done horrible things in my life, things which can never possibly be forgiven. They eat away at my soul, and I owe it to my wife to live as she demands." "Why does she hate me?" "Not because of who you are, but because of what I've done. So the sins of my father have been visited upon me." The man looked at Thomas as though wondering where he had ever heard such a phrase, but he did not ask him where it had come from. If Thomas had been shown kindness in secret, the man would be more grateful than angry. "I promise you, I will burn for what has happened to you." "I don't want you to burn. It would ease my conscience if you did. My life has been spent easing your conscience. I've done all that I can." "Then tell me, what can I do? How can I ease your suffering?" Thomas thought about the man's offer. He considered the cakes and the gifts that the others had always enjoyed at Christmas. He considered the walks that he had taken with his brother and the joy of being outside. But the one wish that rose above all of the others came from his memory of the violin. "When I was little and my brother showed me the kindness that you have not, we discovered something in your workshop." The man seemed to know what he was speaking about. He nodded and said, "The violin. You know how to use it." "I haven't in years." "Then tonight will be your chance. Your wife is not home. There is nobody here to stop you. And my one wish, after a lifetime of suffering, is to hear you play the violin." and so the man went to his workshop and brought the violin back to the house with him. That night, Thomas sat in front of the fire, listening to his father play the violin. Its music was beautiful, and his father's fingers danced across the strings with such grace and control that Thomas was brought to tears. The song was mournful and sweet, and while Thomas had never truly known his father or felt any love from him, he caught a glimpse of the man that night, and for just a moment, Thomas felt the thrill of seeing the stars in the sky on his walks with his brother, and the loving warmth of his older sister's voice as she read him stories, and the protectiveness that he felt toward the younger sister who had thought him evil for so many years. Though most of his family was gone, and he missed them dearly, Thomas came to realize that they were all where they were meant to be, with the people that they were meant to be with. They were all at peace, if just for a moment. Roy owned a car, though he didn't use it very often. He liked to walk most places, feeling the cement beneath his feet and taking in the world around him. When he couldn't walk, there were always trolleys, trains, or buses. He liked being around people, because that's where stories happened. Inside of a car there was silence, whether he was driving himself or taking a cab. All he could do was sit and wait to get from point A to point B. No sights, no sounds, no conversation. At least not when he was doing the driving. The drive to Lakehurst took hours. Those hours felt like days to him, and all he could think along the way was how much he would rather be following up with Joe about the Leah Myers story, or researching the Doors who owned the bakery where Leah had been taken. Instead, he was sitting and looking straight ahead at the back of another car, and occasionally honking his horn, waving his fist, and yelling, "What are you doing? Learn how to drive," to people who couldn't hear him and probably wouldn't care if they could. There were times when he thought that he was the only man on Earth who knew how to drive. He reached Lakehurst shortly before noon and drove through the area just to get a feel for the place. He drove to the base where the crash occurred and stopped to ask if he could take a look around or interview some of the people who were there the night it happened. He was told that he would have to fill out a request form and make an appointment to come back in a few days. Roy tried to wave his press pass around and go on about the right of the people to know the truth. He tried to demand answers and force his way through some loophole in the system, but none of this worked. It was worth a shot, but he hadn't been counting on the cooperation of the Navy. After all, if someone had prevented the news of Harvey Jenkins' death from getting out, it would have been them. So he left the base, planning to come at the story from other angles, which wouldn't require the cooperation of the federal government. From the road, he could just barely see the spot that had been plastered all over the front pages of every newspaper in the civilized world only 2 years earlier. His mind projected images of the fiery crash and the sounds of people screaming in horror. Had Harvey Jenkins been one of those people? One would hope that his death had been quick and painless, but the truth was that a massive ball of fire and twisted metal was falling out of the sky on top of him. The terror must have been unspeakable. Roy made a note to play up that angle when he wrote his story. Of course, he'd have to be classy about it so that the kid's mother wouldn't cry about it on the radio the next day. Just down the road from the base was the Airship Tavern. It was far from the most impressive place that Roy had seen in his life. It lacked the swing and jump of modern city clubs, but it had a certain small-town appeal to it, and it was well lit, which was a step up from the places he'd been spending his time lately. He took a stool at the counter and looked around the place as he waited to be served. Though not quite lunchtime by Roy's estimation, those who had plates of food sitting in front of them were eating healthy servings of meatloaf, chicken, and hamburgers, hardly what Roy would expect during breakfast hours. Judging by the uniforms worn by several of the men who were sitting at tables around the place, Roy didn't expect to find many Nazis in the airship. This was a place where the base employees spent their off hours, which meant that he'd have to be careful about the questions he asked and how loudly he asked them. "Coffee?" asked the voice of a man on the other side of the counter, getting Roy's attention. The man was tall and muscular. He didn't look like the sort of person who would be slinging hash to locals. Roy suspected that this was Clive Bartlett, former employee of the base. Those surroundings would fit the man's appearance much better than the counter at the airship. "Yeah, regular," Roy responded, smiling politely. He didn't want to jump right in and start asking questions. He needed to ease into the conversation. As the man who Roy assumed was Clive put a cup of coffee in front of Roy, Roy kept that warm, small-town smile on his face and asked, "What's good to eat around here?" Clive didn't seem the talkative type. He shrugged and answered, "I like the steak sandwich. If you're looking for breakfast, we have ham and eggs, hot cakes, oatmeal. Ham and eggs will be fine." Clive nodded and walked off to put in the order. Once he was done with that, he went back to work wiping down the counter and straightening up the area. Roy kept an eye on him, trying to figure out the best way to lure Clive into a conversation. He didn't want to spook off his best lead, so he had to be careful. He was halfway through his meal by the time he finally said to Clive, "Say, this is the place where that airship crashed, isn't it? The Hindenburg." Clive looked over at Roy, not seeming particularly eager to discuss the subject, and nodded. "That's right, I remember reading about that. Horrible thing," Roy said, as he took another bite of his food. Once he had swallowed that bite, he went on. "Were you around here back then?" Clive responded with a simple, "Mm-hmm." That must have been something else. Roy took a sip of his coffee and tapped his finger on the counter, as though he were recalling some faint memory. "You know," he said, "I have a buddy who used to work around here, him and his cousin both. He used to swear up and down to me that his cousin died in the crash, but I'm pretty sure that he was just making the whole thing up. I looked in the newspapers and never saw his cousin's name listed anywhere in the reports." He watched Clive, waiting to see if there would be any sort of reaction to his comments, but Clive went about his business as though he hadn't even heard what Roy was saying. Roy decided to press on. "I bet you get that a lot around here with a story as big as that one. Everyone's claiming they know someone, or they were there, or whatnot." Another bite of food, playing the whole conversation down as though he were just making small talk with the locals. He kept his voice down in order to avoid being heard by anyone else in the place. He wasn't sure that all of the locals would be as sensitive to the subject as Clive, but he didn't want to run the risk of getting his face pounded on either. He waved his finger as though to say aha, and said, "Jenkins, Harvey Jenkins, that's the guy my pal said died. I remember because I used to have a dentist named Jenkins back in..." Before he could finish that sentence, Clive grabbed his plate of food and pulled it off of the counter. He was obviously upset, though he remained perfectly composed and spoke with a normal tone as he said, "Don't forget to leave a tip on your way out." "I'm not sure I understand," Roy replied, still trying to play innocent. "I told you that I wasn't interested in talking." Roy dropped his act and said, "I'm just looking for answers. Look somewhere else." "Is that what I should tell Harvey's mother, his brother, his cousin who lost everything he had in the world because people thought he was crazy? Should I tell them to look somewhere else?" For just a moment, it looked as though Clive might respond after Roy mentioned Harvey's cousin. He looked like there was something that he wanted to say, but he stopped himself. Finally, he told Roy, "I don't know anything about anyone named Harvey." "What do you know?" Clive hesitated before he said, "Nothing. I don't know anything." Clive started to walk away, but Roy didn't have to be a genius to see that he knew more. Clive was holding back. But why? Michael was sitting at his desk, waiting for the files that he'd requested on the Door Bakery to be delivered. He planned on going to the bakery himself and investigating what Joe had told him over the phone, but he needed a warrant for that, and that meant that he needed more information. Michael was the type of man who liked to have information before leaping into a situation. He liked to have facts and evidence. He liked solid proof. But Joe was something else entirely. Joe worked on feelings and instinct. He was a valuable resource, but at the same time, Michael worried that Joe relied too heavily on the intangible. He worried that Joe would overlook what was right in front of him because he was caught up in whatever he felt at the moment. The urge to call Joe on the telephone and make sure that he was sitting still was strong, but Michael wanted to wait until he had something more to offer. He couldn't just call Joe and say that he was worried, and if he tried flexing his muscles too often by telling Joe to stay out of official police business, the chances were that Joe would simply stop including him altogether. He had the Meyer file in front of him on his desk. He had gone through Max Weber's file for the 10th time that morning. He was skimming through Carl Gottschalk's file. There was nothing new to be learned from them, but he was reading them anyway just in case, while waiting for the Duer files and what he hoped would be the final string that could tie his whole case together. Out of the corner of his eye, Michael could see a dark figure. He looked past the file in his hands and saw a middle-aged man wearing a black, perfectly tailored suit and holding a folder in his hands, standing on the far end of the room. Perhaps Michael wouldn't have thought anything of the man if the man hadn't been staring directly at Michael and didn't start walking toward him as soon as he had Michael's attention. Michael put Carl Gottschalk's file down on his desk and closed the folder as the man approached. "What can I do for you?" he asked as the man came near. "Detective O'Shea?" "Yes." The man reached into his pocket as he said, "My name is Don Williams. I work for the federal government in Washington." "Which part of the federal government?" Mr. Williams pulled his identification card from his pocket and showed it to Michael. The card listed Donald Williams as an advisor to the office of the president. Michael looked at the card and then leaned back in his chair and said, "That doesn't really answer my question. I work in intelligence gathering, providing the president with information in regards to national security matters." "I see," Michael nodded. "What does that have to do with me?" "I've been keeping an eye on you, Detective. Your friendship with Joseph Oster. Your investigation into the disappearance of Leah Meyer. Why would the president care about one missing girl? We're more interested in the people who took the girl. Your investigation caught our attention." "You think these Nazis pose a real threat to us?" "Yes." "Then why kidnap her? Why draw attention to themselves?" "Because they need her, not for who she is, but for what she can do." The man placed his folder on the desk in front of Michael. The file was labeled Door. Michael didn't hesitate to open the file. As he skimmed its contents, a chill ran through his spine, and his breath caught in his throat. When he could find the will to speak, the only words that came to mind were, "Oh, my dear God." It felt different, Sam told Mary as he looked across the park toward the horizon. She was sitting on a bench, but Sam was on his feet. He couldn't sit still. There was something about him that had changed, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "I've spent so much time looking in at his world, trying to figure out why I'm not a part of it. Today I realized I'm not a part of it." He looked at her and smiled, as though he had told her the most profound thing that had ever happened to him. Yet Mary didn't understand what he was saying. To her, it seemed as though he was saying the same thing twice. "It's his world," Sam explained. "He was generous getting me the job there, but it was still his world." "And now?" she asked, trying to figure out where all of this was going. Sam sat down next to Mary and took her hand. She could sense that he was going to tell her something that she might not want to hear, but the look in his eyes didn't seem like a bad look. It seemed hopeful, for the first time since she met him. "I've been reevaluating things, ever since I met Joe, ever since he made me realize that I'm not what everyone says I am. All this time, I thought I was done. I thought that there was nothing left for me to do, that my dreams were over. I didn't see anywhere else to go, so I figured that there was nowhere else to go. I just settled." She hated hearing Sam talk like that. She knew that he was a bit shy at times, and he wasn't the most ambitious person that she'd ever met, but he had never seemed like a dead end to her. She had always seen Sam as someone who just needed to find his way. He smiled at her and put a hand under her chin, lifting her head and looking her in the eyes. He said, "You changed my life. You saw Harvey, you introduced me to Joe, and now I know that there's something I have to do. I have to help him. I have to stop whatever it is that he's afraid of." "How?" "I don't know. But I do know that I need to listen to him. I can't keep running away from the fact that he's here. I can't hide in someone else's world, shutting out my own." "What does that mean?" Sam took a deep breath, and his smile faded. Now she knew that he was about to tell her something much scarier. "I quit," Sam said, standing up once again and looking down at the ground so that he could avoid looking her in the eye. "I know, it's irresponsible, it's immature. I shouldn't throw away a good opportunity just so I can chase a ghost." "You absolutely should," Mary said, so matter-of-factly that he nearly missed it. Once his mind caught up to her words, he turned to her and gave her a questioning look. Mary stood and took Sam's hands in her own. She told him, "Joe spent so much of his life running from what he is that it nearly killed him. I saw what it did to my sister. Now, I'll never say this to his face, and I'll deny it if you tell him I said so, but..." Mary couldn't bring herself to finish that sentence before a lump in her throat stopped her. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Sam, trying to get the words to come out of her mouth, but she couldn't force them to. She couldn't tell him that deep down in her gut, she knew what killed her sister and her niece. Sam pulled her close, letting her know that she didn't need to finish what she was saying. After a moment of holding her there, she said to him, "I can't watch the same thing happen to you." "It won't. I'm going to find a way to help Harvey. And I'll be there to help you." Joe drove across the bridge, which led into Avon by the sea. He and Annalise had been on the road for hours and had remained quiet most of the way. With each mile that passed, a knot in Joe's stomach grew tighter and tighter. He wasn't sure that he could handle what he was about to do. The one thing that reassured Joe was Annalise. Because of her and what she felt, he knew that he was on the right path. She wasn't nervous at all. As the knot in his stomach tightened, her excitement grew. She didn't seem to have any doubts or fears. All she felt was an urgency to reach their destination. As they drove past the beach, Joe could smell the ocean air blowing through the open windows of the car. He breathed deeply. Avon was a calm and beautiful place. There were houses of every style, from classic Victorian to modern craftsman, which blended together, painting the picture of a warm and inviting beach town. The lawns were neatly kept, with bright green grass cut short and perfectly sculpted bushes. Children ran along the boardwalk, laughing and playing. It was the type of place where wealthy city dwellers would no doubt love to spend their summers. He parked his car near the boardwalk and kept his hands on the wheel as he looked straight ahead. From where he was parked, Joe could see neither the sand nor the water, but the roar of the ocean washed over him, soothing his nerves only slightly. He smiled a weak smile and said to Annalise, "It's like another world, isn't it? Coming from the city to a place like this." "My family used to vacation on the shore when I was a little girl. I always hated getting sand in my hair, but my sister loved it. She'd laugh and play like one of the boys. And all that time, I just wanted to get back to the city." Joe took a deep breath and told her, "We passed the street just before I parked. We can go the rest of the way on foot so they won't hear the car outside or the doors closing when we get out." She reached over to the steering wheel and took his hand as she said, "You seem nervous." "I don't normally do this sort of thing." "You freed that kidnapped boy." "I didn't have time to think about that." "But you did it, and I have faith that you'll do just fine here, too." Annalise moved her hand to Joe's face. She lightly turned his head so that she could look him in the eyes, and she said, "You are a wondrous man." She leaned across the seat of the car and kissed Joe. It was a slow, lingering kiss, which melted his nerves while tightening the knot in his stomach all at the same time. Once she pulled away, she opened the door and stepped out of the car. Joe followed, and the two of them started walking toward the Door house. As they made their way down the street, Joe counted the addresses on each house and allowed the feelings of the area to wash over him, just as the sound of the ocean had. He had always found it interesting how each town and city could feel like its own separate world. To anyone who couldn't feel what he felt, it might seem as though people felt the same everywhere, but each place had its own concerns and atmosphere. Each had its own secrets. Avon was filled with all of the things that Joe would have expected to find in a small beach town. Girls playing hopscotch along the slate sidewalk. All but one of those girls was young and carefree, while the last girl seemed to have the weight of the world on her shoulders. One house where owners were just arriving for the summer, moving bags from their car. They were relieved to be there, yet they were tired and stressed, to the point where the travel almost didn't seem worth it in Joe's eyes. From the houses, Joe picked up on the day-to-day routines, which people neither thought nor felt much about, aside from boredom. As they drew closer to their destination, Joe started to feel something else from one or two of the neighboring houses. It was hard for him to pinpoint exactly what that feeling was, but it seemed like a fog of darkness, drowning the other emotions from those houses. Perhaps if he had time, Joe would have explored that darkness, but he had a job to do, and he needed to remain focused, so he decided to use some of his recently acquired control over his skill and tune out his surroundings entirely. Unfortunately, that decision left him alone with his own nervousness. They were getting close. Joe could see the house, which he assumed would be the door address. It was a 2-story craftsman-style house, painted white, with a walkway that led from the sidewalk up a small hill to the front porch. How anyone could get a kidnapped woman from the street into the house without someone noticing was a mystery to Joe. He stopped walking, with Annalise right beside him. She asked, "Are you all right?" "If we walk right up to the door, they could see us," he said to her. "They know us. They know who we are and what we look like." "What do you want to do?" After thinking about it for another moment, Joe said, "There's an alley behind the house. Maybe we can get to the backyard and get a look inside before they know we're here. See if we can spot your sister." "What makes you think that the backyard is any safer than the front?" "I'm not sure it is. Maybe the front yard is a better choice because they won't shoot us dead right out in the open," Joe conceded. "I don't know." "But your gut tells you to go around back." He nodded. Without another moment of hesitation, Annalise turned around and started to walk toward the last intersection. The alley was empty. Though there were several cars parked along the sides, the buildings which lined the alley were mostly detached garages, with an apartment above 1 or 2. Unless someone was going out or mowing their lawn, Joe and Annalise could assume that they were safe from prying eyes. Once they reached the Dewar house, they hurried past the exposed backyard, hoping that they wouldn't be seen from any of the windows in the house, and hid themselves behind the garage. "Did you see anyone?" Annalise asked him. Joe shook his head and told her, "I'm more concerned with whether or not they saw us. If they did, wouldn't they be running outside by now?" He didn't know how to respond to that question. Sure, it seemed reasonable enough to assume, but for all he knew, Max and Carl were rounding the garage at that very moment, each with a gun in hand. Joe tried to shake off that thought. He didn't feel anyone that close, aside from Annalise. "Are we sure that this is the right house? Or the right door, for that matter?" Again, Joe didn't know what to say. He thought it was the right place, but he couldn't be sure, not without some proof. He turned toward the garage, and the sun's reflection in one of the door's glass panels nearly blinded him. But once he could see again, he looked through the glass at the car that was parked inside. Annalise looked at the car as well, and asked him, "Is that it? I've only ever seen it from the front." "It's a Ford," Joe concluded. "I suppose it could be." "This isn't working." Annalise thought for a moment, and then started walking to the far end of the garage. Joe followed her, and found himself looking at a narrow space between the side of the garage and the waist-high chain-link fence that separated the Dewar property from their neighbor. Annalise held out one hand, which Joe took. She used him to stabilize herself as she climbed over the fence. Once on the other side, she smiled at him and said, "It should be easier for you, you're wearing pants." Once he climbed over the fence, she led the way to the corner of the garage, where they remained hidden from anyone inside the house while gaining valuable progress. At the corner, she turned to Joe and said, "Now focus your ability." "On who?" "Whoever's inside the house. How many of them are there? What are they feeling?" She could tell that he was unsure of his ability to be so specific, and she took his hand in her own as she said, "I have seen you look through my window and pick one person out of a crowd, shutting everyone else out. That was an experiment, a game. It was practice. This is what you've been growing toward. This is what you are meant to do." Joe didn't say anything in response. He simply took in her words and closed his eyes. He opened his mind to the world around him, sensing Annalise more than anything else. She was hopeful and excited, though there was a hint of anger inside of her, a thirst for vengeance. There were waves of amusement from a nearby house, and annoyance from somewhere else. There was frustration, passion, disappointment, delight, love. Then, suddenly, there was a razor-sharp sense of anger, which caused Joe to jump back in shock. The anger was not a normal emotion coming from inside the house. It was more like what he had experienced in the presence of Harvey Jenkins' ghost. But this was not Harvey. This emotion had a different essence to it. "Joe, what is it?" "There's a ghost in that house." "A ghost?" "Something angry. Something dangerous." "Dangerous? How?" Joe didn't know how to explain what he felt. He didn't know how to make her understand the chill that ran through his spine as he felt that anger. He turned and started to walk toward the alley, saying, "This was a mistake. We should have waited for the police." But Annalise wouldn't hear it. She ran in front of him and stopped him before he could leave the yard. She kept her voice down, but was noticeably upset as she said, "No, we have to finish this. We have to do this now." "Why? We can find a telephone. We can come back here within the hour." "As soon as they thought you might track them down in the city, they ran. What happens if they catch on? What happens if they realize that we've been here and that we're coming back? I'm not scared of ghosts, Joe. They can't hurt us. They can't do anything to us. What I'm scared of is losing the opportunity to look those people in the eyes and finish this. I've waited too long. I can't walk away now, not even for a little while." He didn't try to push past her. Instead, Joe took time to consider why he was there. Somewhere in that house, there was a woman being tortured. If her kidnappers were comfortable keeping her in that house, it most likely meant that she was past the point of screaming. Annalise was right. Joe knew that he couldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. He needed to save Leah, and that meant that whatever emotions were holding him back, he needed to ignore them. He needed to push them aside until he couldn't feel them anymore, just like he had learned to do with the emotions of other people. He stepped past Annalise and focused on the house once again. He allowed his own feelings to melt away into nothing, and he let the emotions of that house become all that he could feel. "Do you feel them?" Annalise asked him, sounding eager to push forward. "Yes," Joe replied, once again sensing that sharp, burning anger. He pushed that ghost aside and tried to feel the others in the house. "There are 4 people in the house, not including the ghost," he continued. "They're upset. Something isn't going as planned." "Can you sense Leah? Is she in there? Are you sure that this is the right place?" "I don't know. I can feel 3 of the people strongly. One of them is very upset. It's irrational. It's frantic. But there's one person who feels almost nothing except..." Joe was trying to wrap his mind around that one person whose emotions were so faint that they nearly didn't exist at all. There was something strange about these emotions, something that he had never felt before. 4 people, Annalise repeated to herself, thinking. The 2 men, Max and the other one, Leah, and the baker's wife. That's the right number of people. I can't be sure it's them. Joe thought about what he wanted to do, and finally decided that what he wanted didn't matter. He needed to move toward the house and get a look inside with his own eyes. Trying not to think too much about what he was doing, Joe moved away from the garage and made his way along the fence toward the side of the house, with Annalise close behind. At the side of the house, Joe found a window and looked inside. What he saw was a bedroom, plainly decorated with 2 beds. There wasn't much that he could make out in the room, except for a book which sat on a table near the window. Its cover was plain, but Joe could make out the title of the book, Der Mythos des 20 Jahrhunderts. He must have muttered the title under his breath, because as he recognized the book, Annalise asked him, "What does it mean?" "The Myth of the 20th Century," Joe told her. "It's a Nazi book. I've heard of it at the store." Joe then looked at Annalise and assured her, "We don't sell it." "That must mean that this is the place. Unless there are more Nazis out there than we think." Joe shifted his weight and tried to get a better look at the bedroom, but there wasn't much for him to see. Inside the house, he could hear the faint sound of voices coming from another room. He wanted to move to another window and get a look inside, so with Annalise behind him, Joe began to walk. He didn't get very far before he heard the sound of Annalise gasping. It was the last thing he heard before the world went dark. Roy had been at the airship for an hour and a half, picking at his lunch and ordering more coffee just to keep from getting kicked out of the place. Clive was trying his best to ignore Roy. He would come and tend to whatever his job demanded, but the small talk was over. Despite Roy's efforts to get Clive into a conversation, there hadn't been much said between them for quite a while. Roy hated driving a long way for an interview like this, because he hated the possibility that he would go home with nothing. He hated giving someone else the power to decide whether or not he could do his job. As he sat there, Roy watched Clive. He saw the man avoiding eye contact with him. He saw Clive going out of his way to avoid talking to him. Yet what he didn't see was Clive raise his voice. If Clive had raised his voice, it would have drawn the attention of everyone in the place. It would have made Roy look like the sleazy reporter out to make $1 off of a local tragedy. No, when Roy watched Clive going about his business, he didn't see a man who wanted the reporter to go away and leave him alone. He saw a man who was waiting for the right reason to talk. Roy swallowed the last of his coffee and held up his cup for a refill. As Clive came near, Roy said, "Do you know why I became a reporter?" Of course, Clive didn't respond. Roy pressed on, saying, "I became a reporter because the world should know the way things work, because I want to know the way things work and I want to tell everyone else. I want people to read it and see my name next to it and know that I was the one who figured it out." Clive finished refilling Roy's coffee and moved away. "You can take my plate, I'm done," Roy said, bringing Clive back. He wiped his mouth with his napkin and tossed it onto the plate as Clive walked back to him. "Of course, my boss doesn't see things the way I do," Roy told him. "I have a story that could change the way people see the world, and he has me out here looking into some kid's death. But the thing he doesn't know, the thing I never told him, is that it's all related." Clive had cleared Roy's plate and was moving away. Roy tipped his cup of coffee over, never bothering to pretend that it was an accident, and earning a dirty look from Clive as he came back once again. "See, the boy who died, Harvey Jenkins, I found out about him from his cousin, this other kid named Sam who got kicked out of the Navy. Ever hear of a Section 8? He could see Clive tense up, if only slightly, so he knew that he was on the right path. "It means they think he's crazy. See, he could have sworn that his cousin wasn't really gone. All kinds of strange things were happening, and he thought that it was all because of his dead cousin, the one that the newspapers just happened to forget about. Now, isn't that the strangest thing you ever heard?" Still, Clive said nothing. He went about his work of cleaning up Roy's coffee and then began to move on. But Roy could see that he was thinking about what Roy was telling him. He was considering it. "I'll have another coffee if you don't mind," Roy said, and Clive came back to give him another cup, never looking at him as he worked. As Clive poured, Roy continued. "See, the part that's even stranger, I actually believe the kid. I believe that his cousin was hanging around. What I don't know is why nobody reported Harvey's death in the newspapers. Why didn't that family get the recognition they deserved?" Clive's jaw clenched. In that moment, Roy knew that he wanted to talk, but he wasn't sure that he should. He wasn't sure what it would mean to him or his reputation, which was a concern that Roy saw often enough in his line of work. Roy leaned forward and whispered, "If you want to say something, I don't have to let anyone know you said it. Nobody else here will hear you." Clive remained silent but didn't move away. Roy was making progress. "Why did you leave the base?" Roy asked. "Were you in the Navy? Was it another Section 8? "I was a civilian," Clive responded, looking around to make sure that nobody was listening to him. For a moment, it looked like he might walk away again, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "I had an accident as a kid. I'm blind in one eye, so I couldn't—" "I understand. You did the work you could there. You were serving in your own way." Clive gave Roy a look that told him that it probably wasn't smart to be overly sympathetic. Clive didn't need to be handled with kid gloves. Roy put up his hands, allowing Clive to continue. "They tried to tell me that I was seeing things, but that's not the way this works. I see just fine," Clive insisted. Roy was curious to see where this would go, so he asked, "What did you see?" Clive took a moment to gather his thoughts before looking around the tavern once again, and then leaning closer to Roy. He whispered, "The reason nobody reported that kid's death the night it happened was because people saw him after the accident. He was accounted for. And it was only later that they realized that they shouldn't have seen him. Nobody should have seen him. So they kept it quiet. And told anyone who saw him that they were crazy." Roy nodded. "Mental trauma brought on by the crash. It seemed to be going around, and it made more sense than the alternative," Clive explained. "Maybe they didn't know any better, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that this Jenkins kid wasn't the only one. There were other bodies that weren't reported. People who weren't supposed to be on that ship." The year after Thomas spent Christmas alone with his father, the man's wife fell ill and died. She left her youngest daughter alone to care for her father and the brother that had been kept locked away. Thomas dared to hope. He dared to think that with the man's wife gone, he would be allowed out of the bedroom and would be allowed to live life as any other member of the family had lived. The young girl begged her father to let Thomas free at last, but the man was frozen in grief. He sat in a dark room, mourning not only for his wife, but for the life that he had taken from himself by being unfaithful to her. More than ever, the regret of his actions consumed him, because though he had always dreamed of forgiveness, it had never been granted. Because of his actions, his wife's heart grew cold in her chest, and her ability to love had been taken. Because of him, his children suffered. While the man knew that the only right thing to do would be to release Thomas, he felt the eyes of his dead wife watching him from beyond the grave, and he longed to earn the forgiveness that he had not been able to earn while she lived. When his youngest daughter found the key to Thomas's room and unlocked the door in order to free the boy, the man stared at his son, and he saw the adult that the boy was becoming. The shape of his face, which matched that of the man himself, the broadness of Thomas's shoulders, yet there remained a hint of the child, the slightly soft features, and the rosiness in the boy's cheeks. The blonde hair falling over the boy's face in waves, the blue eyes as clear as a crystal. When the man looked at Thomas, he saw his own features blended with those of the woman with whom he had been unfaithful, and though he thought the boy was beautiful, Thomas's appearance reflected his own beautiful sin. He could not stand to find beauty in what he had done. He could not stand to admire the results of his actions. To love Thomas felt like a sin in and of itself, and so the man locked Thomas away once again. His youngest daughter wept for her brother, who had been granted only a glimpse of a normal life. She pleaded with her father, but her begging went to waste. The man took the key to Thomas's room and wore it around his neck as a constant reminder of all of the ugly things in his life and what awaited him when he died. The door to Thomas's room remained locked throughout the day and only opened to allow for the most basic necessities of life. Truly, it would have been more kind to kill Thomas as an infant than to force him to live a life such as what he had. At last Thomas had reached an age where he would be able to leave the house behind and strike out on his own. He would be able to see the world and live as anyone else. But his freedom was met with fear. After his father opened the door and released the boy as though he were nothing more than a bird who had flown through the window, Thomas did not know where to go. He walked down the road until he could walk no more. When strangers spoke to him, Thomas looked to the ground and spoke quietly in response. Though free of his home, Thomas was now a prisoner of his own mind, longing for that hidden corner of his room which had provided safety and comfort in the past. The imagination, which was once his only comfort, was now his greatest enemy. He imagined what strangers on the street must think of him, how awkward he was, how he didn't belong in the world. Thomas fought hard against that enemy. He forced himself to become a part of the world and to begin a new life for himself. Though he remembered every detail of his captivity to a remarkable degree, he would not allow those memories to destroy him. As he grew accustomed to life on his own, Thomas eventually found that his perfect memory was a great asset. He learned quickly. He could retain information that others would forget within minutes. With his ability, Thomas could be a valuable member of society and a servant of his government. He could be a hero. 6 years after leaving home, Thomas received a letter from his youngest sister, informing him of his father's death. Reluctantly, he returned to the home in which he had been kept prisoner for the early years of his life. The house, which once looked as large as the world to him, now seemed small and insignificant. His brother did not return home after the passing of their father. He had moved as far away as possible, and he swore to never return. His sisters stood with Thomas in that house, and each of them looked around at all of the objects which had comprised their parents' lives. They each looked for any item that they would care to take with them as they left that place behind once and for all. The girls looked upon that house with disgust, and told Thomas that they wanted nothing of their parents to keep with them. They would be happy to forget the people who had raised them, and would take delight in seeing the house burn to the ground. They walked out of the house and waited for Thomas on the road which would lead them away. As Thomas stood alone in that place, he felt pride in the man he had become in spite of those who had raised him. He said goodbye to the boy who had been locked away, and he turned to walk out of the house for the last time, but something caught his eye. Sitting in the corner, buried beneath blankets and pillows, Thomas saw the old violin case which his father had kept in his workshop for so many years. At once the memory of that Christmas came back to him, and the sound of the violin music, which gave him the one and only glimpse of affection that he would ever feel for or from his father. Thomas uncovered the case and opened it. He ran his fingers along the curves of the violin and plucked at one of its strings. He took the violin with him when he left, and though his sisters would never understand why he took it or what it meant, Thomas wanted to remember that Christmas always, that one beautiful moment in his entire life when each member of his family had been at peace. Joe tried to open his eyes, but found it harder than usual. He was groggy, and his head was throbbing. His entire body felt heavier than normal, and when he tried to move his legs, he realized that one of them had a chain attached to it. He gathered his senses and looked around at where he was. It was a basement, presumably the basement of the Door house. It was dark and musty. He could see light coming through a nearby window, but it was a dim light, suggesting that it was nighttime. Pulling on the chain that was wrapped around his leg, Joe realized that he was tethered to the basement wall. Annalise was nowhere to be found. As Joe tried to figure out a way out of this situation, he listened for the sound of anyone moving overhead or anyone who might be with him in the darkness of the basement. All he heard, if he listened very carefully, was the faint sound of a baby crying in the distance. "He took the violin with him when he left," she said, in a quiet, soothing voice as she held her baby close and rocked him to sleep. And though his sisters would never understand why he took it or what it meant, Thomas wanted to remember that Christmas always, that one beautiful moment in his entire life when each member of his family had been at peace. She looked down at the sleeping child and wanted to cry, he was so beautiful. Her eyes then moved across the room, to a chair where an old violin case was sitting. She shook her head at it and whispered, "Shh, he's finally resting."
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.